Okay, we're live now. First, say hello to the participants.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our reading linguistic paper together. This is our 61st session. Oh, but beforehand, I need to check the connection. Otherwise, we're just speaking here, nobody could hear us. So if you could hear me clearly, please type a number in the message area. Any number. Okay, thank you very much. Now, good evening again. And today is another special session because, as you can see, we have Professor Martin Hilpert from the University of Neuchâtel with us. I believe all of you are very familiar with Professor Hilpert, his works, and his YouTube videos. Professor Hilpert is one of the leading scholars in cognitive linguistics. He has published extensively on many topics of cognitive linguistics, particularly on constructional change, lexicalization. In addition to the long list of his publication, he also has a long list of videos on his YouTube channels, which I literally recommend in every session. If you haven't watched them, please do. I think Professor Hilpert has made the best introduction video series on many topics of linguistics, including corpus linguistics, cognitive linguistics, construction grammar, and bilingualism. These are the series titles of the playlist on his YouTube channels. Well, actually, this program, the program we're doing now, the Reading Linguistic Paper Together program, was inspired by Professor Hilpert's YouTube channel, particularly the series in which he explained his own book, Construction Grammar and its Application to English. Now it's a second version. I read that book and I also watched that video. I have to say, you will learn, you will understand the book much better than with a video than just reading the book alone. So at that time, I was thinking maybe we could do similar things. Instead of explaining a book, we can explain a paper. If the author explains his own or her own paper, that would be even better. So today we have this honor to have Professor Hilpert with us, and he will guide us through his 2022 book chapter he co-authored with Dr. Susan Flach, titled as The Case of Constructional Contamination in English, Modified long phrase influence adverb placement in the passive. Just from the title, we know it's a very interesting article. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Hilpert. Now I will transfer the host to you so you could share the screen to others. Just a moment.
All right.
Now you are the host now. Everybody could see you share the screen.
Okay, perfect. So before I share the screen, thanks a lot, Lang, for this very nice introduction. I'm flattered, and I'm also very happy to hear that that the videos I put on YouTube actually, inspire others to do more things like this. I think this is great. I think this is way more than I could have hoped for. I really just put up the videos for my students to watch, to make my teaching a little bit more interactive and pleasant. And I'm really happy to learn that this has brought me in touch with people like you, with other viewers of the channel, and basically with students of linguistics all over the world. So very happy to be with all of you. Well, for you, it's already the evening. For me, it's the afternoon. All right, so I'll share my screen, and then I will talk about a recent paper that Susanne Flach and I have been writing together. So this is joint work. Susanne, well, maybe since we're on the topic of videos and useful online resources, if you Google her name, Susanne Flach, so you see her name on the screen here, she actually has very cool YouTube videos. And one thing that she has published is a package for R that allows you to do what's known as constructional analysis. I'll say more about this because it's part of this paper. So if you're interested in doing constructional analyses, so you can download the R package. You can use R, of course, it's a free software. And on her YouTube channel, there are free tutorials that allow you to see exactly how it's done. The package comes with data sets that are already preloaded, and it makes it really, really easy and intuitive to do your own analyses. All right, so with that in mind, let's get into the paper. The title, I have to admit, well, is actually a bit mysterious. So constructional contamination, what does that mean? And why should you care about modified noun phrases and the passive, and how does all of that hang together? Well, I'll try and explain all of that. So maybe before we get into what constructional contamination is, really what this is about is syntactic variation. Yeah, so very often in language, there are grammatical structures that allow you to express the same idea in two or more different ways. Okay, and the kind of variation that we're looking at in this paper is the sequence of an adverb and a participle in the English passive construction. Yeah? So the example that I'm using here, sorry if that is kind of embarrassing to anybody. So the example that we picked here was the disease was sexually transmitted versus the disease was transmitted sexually. We can take a different example. The company was privately owned, or the company was owned privately, or the government was democratically elected, or the government was elected democratically. It's the same kind of structure in all of these examples. So you can switch the order of the adverb that describes how the action described by the participle was brought about. Okay, and in all of these cases of syntactic variation, we can ask ourselves the question, well, why do speakers sometimes do this and why do they sometimes do the other thing? What makes them pick one variant rather than another? And essentially, that is what we're going after in this paper. And the hypothesis that we're testing is this concept of constructional contamination. So I'll get into the topic of what constructional contamination is in just a second. Now, all right, so that's what you could read the abstract and get to the same idea, but I thought I'd explain it this way. All right. So constructional contamination, what I say in the introduction is that it describes a relation between two constructions. And between these two constructions, there is some kind of interaction. So one construction can influence what goes on in the other. Okay, and why is this interesting? What I'm saying is that constructional contamination is evidence for associative links between formally different constructions. So the idea in construction grammar that the constructions that we know are organized in a network and linked from one to another, and these links are active in language production and language processing, and also just in the cognitive representation of language. All right. So that's what I'm saying here. It's relevant for theories such as construction grammar that have a network model of linguistic knowledge. And then I point to this paper, Paypops and Van de Velde 2016. They came up with this concept of constructional contamination. And we tried in this paper to check whether we can also find instances of this phenomenon in English. Okay, all right. So here are some examples where I once again try to illustrate what the kind of variation that we're studying here is all about. So here I have the sentence garlic is widely believed to help protect against infection. So first the adverb, then the participle, and then the alternative garlic is believed widely to help protect against infection. So both of these work, yeah. And then here, stainless steels are extensively used in petrochemical plants. Stainless steels are used extensively in petrochemical plants. So we have two examples where both variants work, but as a proficient speaker of, in this case, English, there are preferences that people have, okay? So for example, with widely and believed, the first variant sounds much more natural, and speakers prefer that over the other alternative. And with used and extensively, it's exactly the other way around. Yeah, so there, speakers strongly prefer the adverb final order. All right. And then the question becomes, why are there these differences in preference? Why do we prefer widely believed over believed widely and used extensively over extensively used? We could say that, yeah, it's just a coincidence and that's the end of it, yeah, but that's not very satisfying. And in the literature, I take a quote from Huddleston and Pullum, which is a general reference grammar of English. They say that only rather broad and approximate flexible generalizations about adjunct placement and sequence can be made. There's great variation and context, style, prosody, and euphony, so that things sound good, play a role in some decisions. So basically they're saying, look, lots of potential explanations, but we don't know anything for sure. Yeah. And that, of course, is great when you find something like that. Someone saying, look, I have no clue how this works. You can throw some data at it and see if you find something. And that's what we wanted to do in this paper. So we want to examine the influence of constructional contamination, which comes in this case from a noun phrase construction that also has an adverb and a participle. Yeah. So if you look at this example here in 3, a widely believed myth or an extensively used technique. Yeah. So that's not the passive. It is a determiner and then an adverb and a participle that act together as an attributive adjective, you might say, for a noun. Yeah, so this is a complex noun phrase, if you like. And in that noun phrase, we have phrases like widely believed or extensively used. Now, the interesting thing is that in the noun phrase, there is no variation. Yeah, in the noun phrase, the adverb always has to come first. Yeah, in the passive, there's variation. You can do one or the other, but in the noun phrase, that's just one thing that speakers can do. And that means constructional contamination could work in such a way that if there's a combination of adverb and participle that is used very often, that appears very often in these noun phrases, then that might have the effect that in the passive, speakers prefer that kind of sequence too. Yeah. So so for example, if widely believed myth is a very frequent noun phrase, then that might explain why in the passive people like to say widely believed instead of believed widely. All right, that's the premise of the paper. And we're trying to address this on the basis of corpus data. Yeah, so here I say, in order to answer this question, we draw on data from the corpus of contemporary American English. And we take frequency measures of these noun phrase construction. And we take frequency measures of the passive, that is the construction that is affected by this contamination. Yeah. All right. If you've read papers of mine, you know that one thing I always do at the end of the introduction is that I give you a quick overview of where this paper is heading. So section 2 kind of goes over the concept of constructional contamination once more. And I talk a little bit about the original paper, and the authors also did a follow-up paper where they presented more examples. All of the examples that they give are from Dutch. So, well, hence our intention to present something on English to see if the phenomenon, yeah, it does not only appear in one language, but rather is cross-linguistically observable. All right, that's section 2. Then in section 3, we discuss what data we used, how we collected the data, what methods we used for the analysis. So we're doing some constructional analysis, we're doing some regression modeling there. And the results of these analyses are presented in section 4. And then in section 5, we take the results and discuss them in a broader context. Yeah? So what do we learn from the overall analysis? Right. So I think I've already given you a first idea of what constructional contamination is. I think we have the time to go over the definition that Papops and van der Velde offer. It's a little complicated, but we can break it down. Okay, so I'll read it to you once, and then I'll talk about the individual parts. So they say that constructional contamination is an effect whereby, so the effect has a result, so that a subset of instances of a target construction is affected in its realization by a contaminating construction. All right, what that means is we have two constructions and one is influencing the other. Yeah? And this other construction has the potential of variation. Yeah? So the first construction doesn't vary, the second one does. And here the first construction can have an effect. And why is there an effect? It's because of a coincidental resemblance between the superficial strings of instances of the target construction and a number of instances of the contaminating construction. All right, so what this means is that the two constructions, they look similar, yeah, but in terms of their syntactic structure, they're actually quite different. Yeah? So it's a case where only the surface structure looks like it could be something else. And this is really interesting because it means that if there is an effect of constructional contamination, then it means that speakers process language in a relatively superficial way. Yeah, so that they don't perform deep syntactic analyses all the time, but rather they just go with the forms, they go with chunks, and they see similarities in language use that are relatively superficial. I'll come back to this point. All right. So their original example is illustrated by examples like this one here in 4. So basically, what they have in Dutch here is the sequence of something wrong. Okay. And the variation there is that this adjective wrong sometimes takes an inflectional affix and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so that's like the parallel to the passive where we have a change in word order. Here it's not a change in word order, here it's just the presence or absence of the suffix. And what is the contaminating construction? Well, here, the contaminating construction in Dutch is also a sequence of something and wrong, yeah? But it's in a very different syntactic context, namely a complement clause construction that something wrong interpreted, that something is wrongly interpreted. Yeah, so this word verkeerd, wrong, is not even an adjective. It's an adverb in this case, and this one never takes the s. Okay, so just like the English noun phrase construction, which doesn't allow you to switch around the order of adverb and verb, this one here doesn't allow you to either take the s or not. All right, and they hypothesize that if something like this, yeah, if a string like something wrong appears frequently in the contaminating construction, then that will lead people to prefer the s-less variant in the contaminated construction. Yeah? And they analyze Dutch corpus data for this, and they find an effect that seems to suggest that, yeah, this is actually what's going on. Okay, and they, of course, connect this argument to the network model of construction grammar, where there are links between constructions, some of them describing category relationships. So those are inheritance links. And then there are other links like polysemy links or synonymy links. And then there are links that in my book I call subpart links. I took that term from Adele Goldberg. So constructions that share some aspects of their form. Yeah? They are associated in speakers' minds. And these links then are called subpart links. You can read up on what I have to say about them. Okay, and the idea would be that constructions that have these subpart links that share some structure and that are mutually connected, they have the potential to influence one another. Okay, there are also theories outside of construction grammar that assume this kind of functionality of links between constructions. So there's a school of thought that goes by the name of good enough syntactic processing. That is very much in line with the argument that Paypops and van der Velde are making, with the argument that Susanne Flach and I are making here. Okay, how can you tell whether there are effects of constructional contamination? There are different ways in which you can use corpus data to determine whether one construction actually influences the other. And so Paypops and van der Velde propose a corpus-based measure that they call string resemblance. And that measure is captured in the formula that you see here. So the frequency of the construction of the noun phrase, so the contaminating construction, divided by the frequency of that same construction plus the frequencies of the two variants of the contaminated construction. So personally, when somebody presents me with a formula and tries to explain what's going on there, it usually takes me a while to understand this. So for the argument, you don't actually need to understand this right now. If somebody later wants to ask a question about how this works, I'm very happy to answer them. But all I need you to take away for the time being is that, all right, there is this measure called string resemblance, and that is what Paypops and van der Velde use to determine whether there are effects of constructional contamination. Right. Now, if we go on to what we did, Susanne and I, with our data, So we used the offline version of the corpus of contemporary American English. And we did some searches in there. We searched the English passive construction with its two orders of adverb, participle, and participle adverb. And then we also looked for noun phrases that would have this complex modifier of an adverb and then a participle, a widely believed myth or an extensively used technique. And that gave us a lot of data that you see summarized here in the first table. So basically, yeah, we retrieved 3 concordances from the COCA. And since it's a really large corpus, those concordances are really big. Yeah, so for adverb initial passives, so the company was privately owned and things like that, more than 300,000 tokens in the entire corpus. And about 3,000 different adverbs, about 6,000 different participles, lots of data. Now, for the other variant of the passive, where the adverb is in the second position, so the company was owned privately, or the steels are used extensively in this industry, still 100,000 examples, and 2,500 adverb types, 3,500 participle types. And the last concordance, well, those are the noun phrases with the complex modifier, about 80,000 tokens. And again, 2,800 adverb types, 2,400 participle types, lots of things going on. So we're not going to have a problem with data sparsity in the analysis. Right. I want to show you immediately that these 2 passive constructions, the variants of the passive constructions, they tend to occur with very different sets of adverbs and participles. And this we can see just looking at the raw frequency. So we don't have to do any fancy statistical analysis to make this point. So you can just look at some examples here. So for example, the problem was well known. Now, it's much more frequent than the problem was known well. Widely used. This ingredient is widely used. 10 times more frequent than this ingredient is used widely. Randomly selected. The participants were randomly selected. The participants were selected randomly. Again, we have a factor of about 10 to 1. And in this table, you also see the frequencies of the complex noun phrase construction. And here, just starting out with the basic logic of our idea, we would have to think that if a combination is very frequent in this complex modifier noun phrase construction, then the hypothesis would be, all right, this is probably going to be relatively more frequent in the adverb initial passive, and less frequent in the adverb final passive. So you see that this works pretty well, for example, for privately owned. Privately owned, really frequent in the noun phrase construction and much more frequent in adverb initial passive than in the adverb final passive. It also works for publicly traded. It also works for highly regarded. It also works for dimly lit. Let's see if there's a counterexample. Not really a counterexample, but so for example, in democratically elected, the difference isn't all that striking. But all the other elements that are shown in this table, they point in this direction. Okay, just to show you two examples where the adverb final order is actually more frequent in the passive. Sentences like the city was hit hard by the hurricane, or the software was designed specifically for children, or something like that. Yeah, so those are combinations that appear relatively frequently with the adverb final order in the passive, although here you see specifically designed is about as frequent as designed specifically. Okay, and then there are also examples where the adverb initial order in the passive is really, really frequent, but this cannot have been an effect of the complex noun phrase, because these combinations don't really occur in the complex noun phrase construction. And so constructional contamination can't really explain everything about the distribution that we see in this table, but maybe it contributes. Yeah. So, and for this kind of question where you have an explanation, where you have a factor that maybe contributes a little bit, what you need to do is adopt some kind of multivariate statistical approach where you can put various explanatory factors into a statistical model and see how they compare to one another in terms of how much variation they allow you to explain. Okay, before we get into that, Suzanne and I wanted to investigate a little bit more systematically how the different passives, how the two variants of the passive differ with regard to their collocational preferences. So this is what we did in the following section now. We take our cues there again from Pijpops and Van der Velde, who do the same thing with a distinctive colloxeme analysis. So that's a kind of analysis that allows you to take two constructions and contrast them in terms of what lexical elements they like to occur with. So we have done that. And in the next tables that we have here in the paper, we see combinations that either like to occur with the adverb initial order. So that's what we see here. And then the adverb final order, which is the next table that I'll show you in just a second. Yeah, so so things like this is well known, or this was best known for something. This is also used. All of these are way more frequent than the adverb final order. So this is known well, just 4 times. This is known best. This is used also. This is used often. Yeah, so there we show clear asymmetries that are much stronger than would be expected by chance. And to take the opposite, so this should be taken seriously, much more frequent with the adverb final order. People should be treated fairly, much more frequent than people should be fairly treated. Yeah. Used extensively. I had that example before. The city was hit hard rather than hard hit. Yeah. Treated equally rather than equally treated, taken lightly rather than lightly taken, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So basic take-home message here is the two passive constructions, they really have different preferences with regard to the lexical stuff that we see in them. That is nice. Yeah. So let's see what we said here at the end of the section. So a comparison of the two tables reveals that the adverb final variant shows a marked preference for example, the adverb only, and for the participle treated. The observation that the two variants of the passive exhibit different collocational preference justifies a more thorough analysis of constructional contamination as a potential contributor to these differences. Yeah, so effectively what we're saying is that yeah, there is something to investigate, and constructional contamination could be an explanation, but we still need to figure out how much of an effect it has, if any. Yeah, and that's what the next section is all about. So here we combined the examples of both passive variants into a single data set. And we actually, well, we didn't take all the data that we have. We just took combinations that occur in both variants of the passive and in the noun phrase construction. Yeah, so that we did that in order to ensure that we're really comparing like with like, and that a combination that appears in the passive has the chance to appear in both variants. Yeah, otherwise the comparison would be unfair. All right. So this meant that we only ended up with about 88,000 examples. And those examples we annotated for a set of different variables. And I'd like to take a minute to talk about those variables. So first of all, the order of the adverb and the participle. Yeah. So does the adverb come first or does the adverb come second? Yeah. So that's our dependent variable in the regression design. And this dependent variable we're trying to predict on the basis of the following predictor variables. And the first prime suspect there is, of course, the frequency in the NP construction. Yeah? How frequently is the combination of adverb and participle attested in the complex NP construction? So, for example, internationally recognized, found 159 times. Well, we can go back to the table here. Well-known attested 110 times, best known attested 212 times, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so all of these frequencies, they are noted at that point. Then we take this measure of string resemblance that I talked about earlier, yeah, which is not a raw frequency count, but a more processed frequency information. Yeah. And there I just exemplify the math for the combination internationally recognized. 159 times in the NP construction, 63 times in the adverb initial passive, 23 times in the adverb final passive. And that gives us this calculation of 159 divided by 159 plus 63 plus 23. So that gives us 0.649. All right. Then we annotated each example in terms of its adverb participle combination and individually for the adverb and the participle, because we wanted to include these items as random factors in the regression analysis. So this is a mixed effects design where you can do this kind of thing. But basically that is just a control variable. And then the next variable, sorry, I'm rushing through this, but I'll talk about the results, and there we can come back to any questions. We added something that Paypops and Van der Velde had not really used, namely a measure of mutual association between the adverb and the participle. So how strongly the adverb and the participle are linked by collocational strength. Okay, so how do we do that? So we used another constructional method, a method that's known as covariant colloxime analysis. And this method looks at the frequency of the combination. So in this case, I took an example like randomly selected. How often do we find randomly selected? How often do we find the adverb randomly? And how often do we find selected? And how often do we find them with other in other combinations. Yeah. All right. So we did this for the data of the noun phrase construction, and this gave us the results that you see in table 5, where publicly traded has the strongest collocational strength. Okay, so when you see the adverb publicly, there's a very high chance that it will be followed by traded. Yeah, so publicly appears 962 times, traded appears 495 times, and 380 out of these co-occur with one another. Yeah? And that is much more than we would expect by chance. Yeah? Let's see, dimly. Yeah, when you see dimly, there's only so many participles that can follow. Yeah, so basically all the time, lit is what follows dimly, and that gives you a very, very high log likelihood value there for collocational strength. And our reasoning for including these mutual associations in the model is that, well, maybe frequency isn't all there is. Maybe just experiencing combinations of adverbs and participles together can have an influence, so that speakers like to use these items in that order in the passive construction. All right. So that's the annotation for the data. The dependent variable, which is the order of adverb and participle, the noun phrase frequency, string resemblance, the random factors, adverb, participle, and the combination of the two, and then the mutual association strength between adverb and participle as another numerical variable. And all of that we fit into a we used to fit a regression model. Since we had a lot of data, we ran the analysis first on just one half of the data set, and we later checked how well our analysis fit the second half of the data set. That's something that is fairly often done in computational linguistics and computer science. And we just did this here because we had enough data to play around with. All right. So as I said, we applied a mixed effects logistic regression model. The table that you see here is what came out. We have 3 variables that come out as significant. The noun phrase frequency, so this is actually the effect of constructional contamination. If a combination is frequent in the noun phrase, then this brings speakers to prefer the adverb initial order in the passive. Yeah, so this is great news. Yeah, so this is essentially the central result of the paper. We get an effect for string resemblance. However, I'll say more about this in a second. The effect is actually in the opposite direction of what Pijpops and van der Velde predicted. Yeah, so that's a little odd, but we have to deal with it because, well, it comes out as significant, and we need some kind of explanation for it. And then also the measure of mutual association comes out as significant, not as strongly, yeah, but still it's significant, meaning that, okay, if an adverb and a participle like to occur together in the noun phrase construction, then speakers prefer this order also in the passive construction. So that's kind of cool. That's not something that could have been, well, okay, so that, let's just say it's an interesting result. Okay, so here we go over the results. The model achieves a decent classification accuracy. So that's just a general check on, is the quality of the model in order. And here we take the second half of the data set and see if the analysis allows us to predict the choices in unseen data. And also there are nicely accurate predictions for the data up from a chance baseline where we just take a guess. All right, and this is just, okay, here we are analyzing dataset B on its own terms, and the factors come out with very similar parameters. So again, this is kind of reassuring that, right, what we found out in the first half of the dataset translates more or less to the second dataset. Right, I'm gonna take like 5 minutes more, if that's okay for everybody to go through the discussion. So the analysis supports the idea of constructional contamination as put forward by Papers and van der Velde. So when you have constructions with these superficial similarities, they can actually influence speakers' behaviors. And so in our case, higher frequencies of an adverb participle combination in the noun phrase construction increases the likelihood that speakers take the adverb initial order in the passive. Yeah, so that's kind of nice. And beyond this general insight, there are 3 further points that we wanted to discuss, bring up. And the first is that this issue of string resemblance, we didn't get the same results as Papers and van der Velde there. And we were wondering, okay, why is there this discrepancy? And in order to explain that, we made this 3-dimensional graph where we have the frequency of adverb initial passives on the y-axis, and then noun phrase frequency on the x-axis, and then string resemblance on the z-axis. And what you see is that the distribution is not very homogeneous at all, yeah, but rather we have lots and lots of combinations that are not very frequent at all in the noun phrase construction. Yeah? So there are a couple that are really, really frequent in the noun phrase construction. And for those, we also obtain high string resemblance. Okay, so that means that there's some kind of positive relation between those two. But we also find very, very frequent adverb initial passive combinations that are not at all frequent in the passive and that are not at all high in string resemblance. And we think that these combinations that are highly frequent in the passive construction are relatively infrequent in the noun phrase construction. Therefore, they score low on string resemblance, and therefore we get the results that we do. Yeah, so the statistical model, the regression analysis, actually tells us that there's a negative relation between those two. Okay, our construction is different from the one that Papers and van der Velde originally analyzed. So we have very high type frequencies in our constructions. The construction analyzed by Papers and van der Velde does not have that. And so one explanation that we suggest is that we used simply a bigger data set with a more frequent construction, and that accounts for some of the discrepancies. Moving on to the second point. So this is the point that text frequencies of constructions are one thing, but collocation measures can also tell us a few things. So adverb participle combinations in our case, they don't need to be highly frequent as long as their components are strongly attracted to one another. Yeah. Okay. And there are findings in the literature that basically go in the same direction, that sometimes association is actually, well, maybe not more important than frequency, but also comes in as a factor. And then we have a last point that connects to issues like contrast in language and analogy as a general structure and processing. If we have a speaker who has encountered collocations such as widely believed in the two constructions, in the passive and in the complex noun phrase, they might then encounter a new collocation, and that would enable them to make an analogy, construct an analogy, so that, for example, when we see something like a copiously footnoted paper in the noun phrase construction, that would encourage or bias the speaker towards constructing a passive construction with the same kind of order of adverb and participle. All right. There are some ins and outs of this that we discuss at the end of the paper, but that is essentially it. And as concluding remarks, we state that, in constructional contamination, it also exists in English. We see effects that are based on text frequency, effects that are based on mutual association between the elements in the contaminating construction and in the contaminating construction. And we can link this to analogical reasoning. We can link this to other discussions that are going on with regard to what's known as statistical preemption. And with an eye to future investigation, we have a note of caution here that there might be other ways of measuring corpus frequencies and operationalizing the measure of contamination effects, but this is ongoing business, and there are lots of things that are left to do. And on that note, I'd probably stop my monologue, and we can turn to some questions and answers, if that's all right with you. All right. Let me stop the sharing.
Okay. We already have one question from the audience. He asked actually in the beginning part of the reading. So the question, I read the question to you. The question is, would you consider constructional contamination as a kind of constructional change, or as a force to cause constructional contamination or constructional change?
So it, I'd say understanding it as a force, I would 100% agree with that. And it is a force that could lead to change if, for example, the frequencies in the contaminating construction change. We would assume that also the usage patterns in the contaminated construction would be affected by that. So so in essence, it's a yes to both alternatives. It's a force that can bring about change if there is change in the contaminating construction in terms of its frequency.
Well, while people are probably freezing their questions, I ask a question. So for me, the term contamination seems to suggest a direction of influence. So if so, how do we know which construction contaminates which construction?
That's actually a great point. So in the cases that Papops and van der Velde analyzed, and also in the case that I presented, the direction is actually, there's only one possibility, because the contaminating construction cannot vary, and the contaminated construction, there is variation. Now, one thing that you could ask is, okay, how do we know that, it could also be possible that the passive in its adverb initial variant has some kind of influence on the noun phrase construction. That's possible, but there the influence would not impact a pattern of variation. So in a sense, we need the variation in order to be able to measure the impact. If we have a construction and there's only one way of realizing it, then we simply don't have a handle to analyze whether and how it is influenced by other constructs. So yeah, I guess part of what makes this concept of constructional contamination tricky is that you have to find this kind of configuration in the grammar of a language, that you have two constructions that look superficially the same, and one of them displays variation and the other one doesn't. And then you try to work out the relations between those. Yeah, so that would be my my thoughts on directionality and how you can figure out who does what to whom in the grammatical network.
Yeah, I'll ask a follow-up question since people are still thinking about their questions.
Sure.
So, well, will there be other factors? Have you also considered other factors that might, come into this model, like the length of the adverb, or the semantic prosody of the collocation? If you plug them in, would that change the model fitting?
Yeah. So if we wanted to come up with like a complete theory of why do speakers prefer initial or final adverbs in the passive, then of course length would come into play. Prosodic factors like so English likes to do these rhythmic alternations, so that stressed and unstressed syllables are nicely distributed, so that you have a nice wavy pattern with stress, unstressed, stress, unstressed, stress, so as far as possible, of course. And there, if you can arrange adverb and participle in such a way that you get the nice pattern, then I'm sure people would go for that. Yeah, so that has been shown in lots of other constructions. Probably semantic considerations. I don't know.
Negative, positive connotation. Maybe there's a difference. I don't know. Just some random thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe. Yeah, I'm sure that there are other factors that I just can't think of right now that would also come into play. So in the paper, I would say we didn't really attempt to work out, the primary goal was not to explain as much variability as possible. The goal was really just to see, okay, if we throw contamination in as a contender, does it hold up? Does it show the effect that Pepops and Van der Velde would claim that it has? And well, that at least came out. So it would be interesting to see if you add lots of other predictors, does it still survive in the same way that it comes out in the analysis that we did?
Thank you. Now I have some questions from the audience. The question from a more practical aspect. How can teachers apply the findings into English writing classes?
Okay. So now I would say the conclusions of this paper, they are mainly interesting at a very theoretical level, where we think about how is knowledge of language generally organized in speakers' minds. So some of the byproducts of the paper that are really interesting for teachers and learners is that even in very, very productive grammatical constructions like the passive, there are these collocational phrases that sound very idiomatic to proficient speakers of the language, and there are combinations that are possible, but not very idiomatic or not very ordinary sounding or probable. And to make teachers and students aware of these combinations and how you can find them out, that I think is something that would be really worthwhile. So if as a teacher you find a way to somehow bring authentic usage data into the classroom, and you present examples that illustrate common collocations, and you show that there is not just right and wrong, but rather there is there's a spectrum from things that are very typical to things that are okay, they work, to things that are somewhat unusual, but they still are okay, to things that are very, very unusual and people will think that they sound funny. So getting into that kind of logic, I find that is very useful, because it can also be very reassuring for students when they hear that, okay, it's actually okay to play around with language and to use combinations that are a little bit unusual. We don't have to be constantly afraid that we're doing something that's wrong. It's rather, we can try to do things that are idiomatic and that correspond to things that proficient speakers of the language do often. But this is so you don't have to worry about hitting the target every time. So you can just try, and sometimes you hit right the center. You completely hit the center of the target, and sometimes it's a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, and there's no need to worry too much about it.
Yeah, particularly in the context of the rejection of so-called native speakers norm standard.
Yeah, so I think the term native speaker is really unfortunate, and so I think there's a really important tradition of work that tries to problematize the concept of what the native speaker is or might be, and tries to replace that with other
Lingua franca or world English or anything like that.
So for example, so I mean, that's where the discussion is coming from, essentially. So if you have someone who has learned English, for example, in places like the Philippines or Malaysia or South Africa or
Singapore,
Nigeria or Singapore, those will be speakers that use English every day in lots of different situations. And they will use a variety that has its own characteristics that is not, so it would be, so it just wouldn't be useful to compare that language use to the speech pattern of, let's say, a middle-aged man in Birmingham, and try the other speakers to get them to talk like the guy in Birmingham. That so first of all, that wouldn't be very useful for the speakers, because all the speakers around them also share their way of talking, and so it is really it really comes down to the question, well, what do we want to see as a convention or a standard or a norm in linguistic usage? And so the term native speaker suggests that there is a target, that there is a norm that we can orient to. And there's nothing wrong with, for example, teachers, second language teachers of English, to try and teach one specific variant that they know. So it really just comes down to, what is useful for the learner, and what do we want to see? What do we want to accept as a convention?
Yeah, we got a couple of more questions in the message area. Would you like to stay a little longer? Just
I'm fine, so I can stay a little longer. That's perfectly fine.
Okay. Another question is following this. Do the types have anything to do with the semantic field? I don't understand what types mean here.
Okay. So I think the question is, so if we look at the two passive constructions and we see that different elements are attracted to initial adverbs and adverb final order, does meaning have a role to play in that? And so that's quite often the case, that when you do this kind of distinctive colloquy analysis or constructional analysis, that certain semantic generalizations jump out. So that, yeah, just to give you an example from my own work, at some point I did a contrast of will and be going to, and the kinds of verbs that appear in these two future constructions. And it turns out that be going to has a semantic preference for verbs that are a bit more agentive, that have a different aspectual profile, so that they express events that are punctual rather than extended, and so on and so forth. And so if we look at the adverbs and participles here in the passive construction, I found it a little bit hard to see any clear-cut semantic tendencies, but maybe I should have a second look and investigate this a little bit more thoroughly to see, well, maybe there are broad semantic tendencies, or at least semantic clusters, that we can identify that motivate the distinction between the two variants on that level. So usually, basically, in most of the cases of morphosyntactic variation that I know of, meaning plays a role on some level. Yeah. Sometimes it's very subtle, but usually it's there, and it just takes a little bit of sometimes it doesn't jump you right in the face, but you have to look for it for a little while.
Yeah, thank you. Xun You have some questions about the terminology in construction grammar. The question is, what's the difference between the construction contamination and allostructions?
Okay. Yeah, so this term allostructions describes variants, alternatives of the same construction, right? So in analogy to allophones, different realizations of the same underlying phoneme, or allomorph, different versions of the same morpheme. Allostructions, different alternative realizations of the same construction. So in a sense, whenever you have allostructions, that's where you could potentially see effects of constructional contamination. Yeah. So in that sense, the two terms are related. So you could define constructional contamination as the effect that one of the allostructs is impacted by a different construction that has superficially the same shape.
Okay, got a final question. It's Sarah Fang asks, is it possible to do such analysis for constructions at the phonological level and for schematic constructions?
Okay. That's a really interesting question. So I've been thinking about other potential examples in English and other languages that I know, and it's not so easy to come up with examples. So constructions with sounds, so variation at the level of sounds. The difficulty would be that as you get to the word level, the potential for these superficial resemblance becomes lower and lower. Yeah. So two words that look the same or sound the same, they usually will be the same word. Yeah. So I guess the only the only scenario I could think of, and I'm totally thinking out loud here. So let's say you have two homonyms, and one of the homonyms displays phonological variation, and the other one doesn't. Yeah, and that might cause variation. So that might cause speakers to prefer one of the variants that is pronounced in exactly the same way that the homonym is. But I don't know if this is what was suggested by the question, and I'm actually not sure how I would analyze that, because of course you would need production data, you would need recordings and things like that. But I'll keep thinking about it. It's a fascinating. So thanks for the thought. It will accompany me this weekend. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Professor Hilpert. That's the end of today's session. Please stay tuned.
I'll stay tuned. Absolutely.
I talked to the participants too. So follow our public account, and you will have the preview alert. So you will not miss the next session. Thank you again, Professor Hilpert.
Thank you. I'll make you host again, don't I?
Yeah. So good night, everyone. See you next week.